So, my name is Michael Jerryson. I'm a professor of religious studies in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Youngstown State University, and I'm a member of the Women and Gender Studies Committee here at YSU. And this was one of the ideas that our committee came together with and talked about this year, was to have an opportunity to talk about women's issues and the role of women in political parties. And so I think we're triply blessed today for the fact that we have two representatives from the Democratic Party, and we'll have two representatives from the Republican Party.
It wouldn't be politics if somebody doesn't hide.
To answer questions from 4 of our own students on the role of women and women's issues. Now, I just want to give a brief intro. First, I want to introduce the panelists that we have to answer these questions. So we have on the end Kristen Olney. She's a graduate here at Youngstown State University, political science, a graduate from the University of Akron with a Master's of Applied Politics. And she's currently the grant coordinator for the Mahoning County Sanitary Engineering Department and a managing member of the KO Consulting, which focuses on political, nonprofit, and small business consulting. Next to Kristen, we have Christopher Anderson, who is also a graduate of Youngstown State University with a summa cum laude BSBA in Marketing Management. He serves as the Executive Director for Political Affairs for the Mahoning County Democratic Party, where he has spearheaded projects such as the Mahoning County Fair Districts Initiative. Next to Christopher is Mark Monroe, who is the Mahoning County Republican Party Chairman. He's a lifelong Valley resident. He's been involved with Republican Party politics for over 40 years, having held numerous party offices, including serving on the Ohio Republican State Central Committee and attending 3 national GOP conventions. And I'm hoping we'll be able to, I guess, give a welcome to Tracy Winbush, when she's here. She is Ohio State Republican Party Treasurer, President of the Ohio Black Republican Association, and the current Vice Chairman of the Mahoning County Republican Party. And so, through this venture we have to help us out in the discussion of increasing political literacy and the role of women and the intersection of gender and politics are 4 fantastic students at YSU. Emily Dawes, here on the left, next by Lindsay Hildreth, Kara Zone, and Kara Rivera. And we've asked them to prepare questions in advance to ask each of the panelists. And we're hoping that after they ask some questions, we'll open it up to everyone else to join in with the questions and answers. So, why don't we start if we can? So, who would like to start for asking your questions to the panel?
Tight, everything.
That's okay. All right, so the first question I have was my favorite to write. I actually had to go through it a couple times. So, as a byproduct of women being underrepresented in politics, which I think we all know is an issue, women are faced with a very unique risk. The overwhelming majority of individuals making policy decisions about women's health issues specifically will never face the types of dilemmas that women face by virtue of them not identifying as a woman. There's an unavoidable gap between the governed and those governing, one that creates a plethora of unjust potential outcomes. So the women on the panel, what does the current male representation of female constituents look like, and what should it look like? To the men, what steps can men take in the status quo to minimize the risks associated with underrepresentation of women? So, whoever wants to take that.
I certainly will. I'd be happy to. I think that when you got through after some facts, some very nice laid out facts there, your question was, what can women do to increase their role? Is that the underlying question?
Sure, but I also think it relates more so to the current, like the status quo and how, men overwhelmingly populate our political system and what their representation of women looks like currently.
Well, I think that, first of all, just some information that, of the 158 million women living in the United States, they represent 47% of the American labor force. And of that 47%, we have a pale comparison of just 19% of the seats in the United States Congress are held by women. So to follow up with her disparity issue, she's right. So what do? So you work with women candidates to run for office. That's the first thing. That's the biggest, that's the number one thing. In 2017, what we see right now, 16,000 women have contacted Emily's list and are looking to run for office. That's the first and foremost I'm going to get to your second part of your question, what do you do with the decisions being made by the majority males? But the number one thing right now is to support women candidates at all levels of office. That is, whenever anybody asks me, what can they do to be involved? The first thing I say is to get involved in a local race and help elect local women. And we've seen that happen just in this past 2017 cycle, and it was a great direct reflection of people getting involved. That is the number one thing that you can do to change how governing works in the United States, is to run women at all levels of government. Then to your second question, I mean, obviously, we see the disparity because a lot of the members of Congress, they don't have the experiences that women have and are living through, and the point is then what you have to do is then, addition to running women, you have to be outside agitators. How many folks even know who their member of Congress is right now? All right, a majority, but not all. So how many have ever called their member of Congress? A few, but not all. So what you have to do is women's groups, coalitions, you also have to petition the government, petition by contacting your representative at the local, state, and national level to say, hey, I'm not sure you're aware of this position. I'm not sure you're aware of what's going on. One of my many hats is I'm very involved with the League of Women Voters as well. And one of the most effective things that we do is we have regular days where we go down and talk to the state legislature about issues right now that are affecting Mahoning Valley, and that's one way. So if you feel that your representatives aren't representing your point of view, sometimes you need to go ahead and take your point of view and the facts and stuff to those representatives. And if they're going to be the elected office holder and you don't feel that you're being represented as a female on female issues, then we have to build coalitions, and you have to go ahead and talk to your representatives and reach out and say, hey, I'm not sure you're seeing this from our point of view. And I have found in my experience, no matter what political party, all elected officials have their door open. They want to hear from their constituents. They want to be pushed on the issues. They might not always vote the way that you had wanted them to, but they understand that that's part of their job, and it's not done enough. How many of you have ever visited the county courthouse and went in and talked to the county commissioners or county recorder or any of those offices? Those doors are always open. It's just as citizens, we forget the of, for, and by the people requires the people to participate. So, I don't know, I got on my soapbox there. But I don't know if that fully answered your question, but I'll let everybody else jump in as well.
You know what, before we do, Lindsay, can you just restate again your question so we can have, with Tracy now joining us, hear what it was?
Sure. Do you want me to read all of it?
The whole question.
The whole typed out thing ever, Tracy.
All right. So as a byproduct of women being underrepresented in politics, women are faced with a very unique risk. The overwhelming majority of individuals making decisions about women's health issues specifically will never face the types of dilemmas that women face by virtue of them not identifying as a woman. There's an unavoidable gap between the governed and those governing, one that creates a plethora of unjust potential outcomes. To the women on the panel, what does the current male representation of female constituents look like, and what should it look like? To the men, what steps can men take in the status quo to minimize the risks associated with the underrepresentation of women?
Lindsay, let me start out. First of all, I confess I don't think about this issue in terms of men or women. I think it's a participation question. You know, all of us involved in politics, we long for participation. We wish more people would get involved in politics. It's like so many segments of our society aren't interested in what happens in Columbus or Washington. They're too busy watching Dancing with the Stars or The Voice. And it's, when was the last time you turned on C-SPAN? Come on, there's some good stuff on C-SPAN. I know I'm a little bit goofy on this point, but the point is, participation is urgently needed on all fronts. And I'm glad whenever anybody comes through the door and offers to get involved, put their oar in the water, and help. Now, at a local level, our situation is, I mean, a majority of our party officers in Mahoning County are women, for example. And my own personal perspective is, women do such an amazing job of getting things done and driving things sometimes. I so much appreciate the help and support that we get from the women in our party. But I've got an overall frustration that we don't have more participation, not just from women, but from men. We'll take whoever is willing to get involved, and to the extent that we get good people involved, the country and the community will be a better place.
Thank you.
You're looking at me?
I don't.
Whoever wants
I
to
will,
do that.
I'll say it this way. I agree with Mark, and I agree with the young lady about participation. Communication is the key, and information and education. What I find is, whether you be male or female, black, white, people are undereducated in the political process and who they are and the power that they reign and retain and have. And if you don't know how to wield the power that you have, you give it over to someone else. And over the years, I mean, we're going into 100 years of suffrage for women next year. And getting people to understand what it took for women to vote. Getting what it takes for women to run. It's not that they can't run, they don't run. It's not that they can't lead, they don't lead. And it's not that they can't know, they don't know. You're looking at a campus, you're looking at coming in here tonight, and there are not a lot of women here. But we're talking about women's issues are being represented wherever they are, and that's a problem. And I think men want to hear from us because they don't understand this. They don't understand their spouses. They don't understand their sisters. They don't understand their girlfriends, and they definitely don't understand women at all.
She's got something there.
And I think men want to understand this. But I think that we as women also need to understand men and communicate with them better. And a lot of times, whether it be personal or political, we don't do that. And I think so some of the onus is on us, as well as on the political state of things. Because we come out for issues that are simple ones. You know, women's rights, money, my body, all that kind of stuff. But the things that really matter to us, like healthcare, going to the cleaners. I don't understand why it costs less for a man's shirt than it does for my shirt. Really? Yeah. I mean, so when I look at, so when you look at equality, it costs more for me to get a haircut than for them to get a haircut, even if they have long hair. So there are some things that we really need to have an understanding about that we don't push forward that is every day. And so sometimes we have to come together and decide that it's up to us to take what we want. Because what I'm finding out in America, no one in America gets anything by waiting. You've got to take what you want. Whether it be women or whether it be African Americans, whether it be men, whoever it is. And as long as we allow men to go forward and do what they do, they're going to do it.
Might surprise a couple people as well, but I'm going to agree with Mark too that.
Oh my God.
I know, I felt that way about everything Tracy just said. I was like, I agree.
I agree wholeheartedly with Mark, just from the perspective of from a man in politics, that America does better when women do better. When women lead, they're more willing to work across the aisle than men are on certain issues like health, like issues like education. So I think that from the perspective of a man in politics, it all comes down to empowering women. When a woman says she wants to get in politics, don't just find her a way to get involved, in a menial way. If she wants to run for office, support her in her efforts to run for office. So I think that it's a combination of everything that that's kind of been echoed already. That it takes participation, but at the same time, it takes people who are already in positions in politics to accept that that you need to empower women.
Thank you all. Great answers.
Sure, I'll go next. I'm reading my question off my notes. All right, so Ohio has consistently been recognized as one of the country's most restrictive states in providing reproductive health care for women. Roughly 90% of counties in Ohio do not have a clinic that provides abortion services, and women who seek abortion services are required to undergo an ultrasound to detect a fetal heartbeat. As more of Ohio's reproductive health clinics have been forced to close their doors, women have lost access to the myriad of other health services that these clinics often provide. With all of this in mind, can legislators truly seek equality for Ohio's women while simultaneously placing restrictions on their access to reproductive health care? Why or why not?
Let me go first on that one. I'm against abortion. And I don't like it because I think we deal with the easy part and not the hard part. I think we have to have, going back to education, a number of things. one, there's enough, birth control out there right now, but you really don't have to get pregnant. And if we educate more and more young ladies and young men on reproductive safety, whether it be condoms or whether it be IUDs or whether it be long-term, as well as the pill, they can make that choice before they have to make the choice of I'm pregnant, even the day after pill. But then, with common sense, if we're going to have women's health, you don't have to tie it to reproductive health when it comes to abortion. And that's something that we need to make sure that we understand. You can still deal with your pap smears and deal with your breast analysis without having to go into abortion. For those people who are going to choose to have abortion, we need to make sure that they are safe, that they are clean, and that young ladies under the age of 18, their parents know. If I cannot give you a pill for cramps in the daytime at school, then you should not be able to have a surgical procedure without parental rights. And we need to make sure that we balance that out, because I'm against it and I would vote for it any day of the week. But if we're going to do it, I want to make sure that it's safe and just not in someone's backyard.
You know, abortion is one of the most divisive issues in this country today. There's no doubt about that. I think the polls that have been conducted suggest that the country is pretty evenly divided between pro-choice and pro-life. I lament the fact that over the past 40 or 50 years, I don't know what the number is, maybe 50 million potential human beings have been destroyed through the abortion process. And whether you think it's good or bad, on a personal level, I certainly don't think it's good for society in general. You know, if abortion becomes so common, I mean, even today we're aborting almost 1 million potential humans every year. What does that do for the future of our race? Not a good sign. But again, it's a very divisive issue. My own personal sense is that abortion should be safe, it should be legal, and it should be rare. Unfortunately, today it's not rare. And I would like to see us take more steps to prevent unwanted pregnancies in the first place, and to provide, to make it easier for persons that have unwanted pregnancies to find a way adoption. There's so many couples today that long to have a child in their family and they can't. But yeah, it's a very difficult issue. And interestingly, you know, on the local level, we don't talk about abortion. That's not why we're involved in politics. I'm involved in politics because Washington, D.C. is out of control. It's a mess. We've got a $20 trillion, national debt. There are other things that I focus on. Abortion is something that is a very personal, it's a spiritual issue, and yeah, clearly it's difficult.
So I think that this is one of those issues that has been it's clearly it's a dividing line between both parties. So I personally believe that it's not my business as a man to tell a woman what her decision is as it relates to her own health care. I think that would be the going opinion if you ask most men in our party. But I do agree that there needs to be access to sex education. Abstinence-only sex education doesn't count. There needs to be access to birth control. But what we see, talking about a broken Washington, is people continually trying to take that away. You see Medicaid cuts. Last night they're rolling out. I think it's a $15 million cut or $15 billion cut or something along those lines in Medicaid in the tax reform bill at the 11th hour when they're getting ready to vote on it. You see cuts, continuous cuts in social welfare programs. So, I mean, if we're gonna pretend that there needs to be options prior to forcing women to make that choice, then your party also needs to accept that you need to fund them.
Let me say this.
I get to throw
Okay.
my 2 cents first. So then you could counter. To take your question as a whole, I mean, I think, I want us to become the generation that, you know, finds a happy medium. And with this particular issue, when you look at the trajectory from the 70s till now, we have worked to make this a happy medium issue. Meaning, first of all, the political football always becomes, in a sense, you see these arguments that if you're pro-choice, that means you're pro-abortion. That's not true. That is the least true thing among most liberals. What we need to do is we need to recognize that since Roe v. Wade, this is the law of the land, and that we've gone backwards. We've made abortion, we've tossed abortion to the states, and places like Texas, places like Ohio have some of the most restrictive abortion rights in the country. So if you're really going to, if both parties can agree to the end is to eliminate abortion, then the conversation has to be serious on access to health care, access to contraceptives, and making those things affordable. It's not. It's been a political football for as long as I've been involved. If our true goal is to end and not have any abortion, then we have to fund health care, fund initiatives, fund Planned Parenthood, and places that prevent pregnancy. And if we're going to be a society that says that we're, you know, if our position's pro-life, why are we 46 days into the expiration of the Children's Health Insurance Program? That pregnant mothers and children do not have that access to health care right now as we're sitting here talking. So it's not an issue, I'm always fired up when I talk, ask anybody that knows me, this is just my normal tone. But it's really, I think if our end is to get to 0 abortions in this country, then we have to be serious about the means in which we can fund health care, we can fund contraceptives, we can fund education. And we're not doing that right now. So if we're really going to, if that is both political parties' position is we want to eliminate abortion, then we have to have an honest conversation about the realities of sex in this country, of contraceptives, and access to them.
And if I can just intervene here, so I want to remind you, if we can, we'll just keep this one response apiece, give time for our students to prepare these questions.
I'm sorry.
No, you're good. No, you each did one. You did exactly what we were thinking, but just to remind you. So, and I'd like to say too, we have 2 from the local Democratic parties and 2 from the Republicans here. So it's a whole diversity delivery for you to get more awareness of that diversity. And sure.
In the last response to Kenneth's question, we started talking about a little bit of chaos going on in Washington. So I'm going to just bring this up right now. It seems as though Donald Trump is trying to fool everybody by yelling, fire, to divert the attentions from any of his own misdoings with Russia or anything like that, such as the uranium scandal and the Clinton email non-scandal. How has the party in Ohio distinguished, or both of your parties in Ohio distinguished these as separate issues? And does your party believe that women are held to a higher standard in elections, such as the recent presidential election, and the previous one with Sarah Palin? Has your party been involved in any activity to ensure that politicians maintain an accountability about our national security and not get distracted by gender politics?
Right now in Ohio, our whole executive cabinet are females. Our chairman all the way down to our deputy treasurer. There are no men represented in that executive cabinet.
Why not?
I don't know. Sorry. They ran. They lost. And as far as President Trump, I just left D.C. last evening, and we have a very, very, very large number of women who are represented within the appointment process, as well as within very, very powerful positions in D.C. And he is assuring that we do that. There are some things that have been said in the past during the campaign that I would, wish that would not have been come out or would have not been said, but it is what it is. And people are people. And I found out that good people make bad decisions along the way. And that includes all of us. But with that said, women's issues and running for office, are we held to a different standard? And I have run for office. Not necessarily a different standard, but we don't help one another out. So you run for office and the people that you thought would help you are not there. So it's not a, and that's male and female. You know, you have to get your vote out and you have to get out there and you have to deal with who you are and what comes. You don't get to choose the standard. Are the questions harder? You know, not really. Women are prepared. When Sarah Palin ran, did they say she was pretty and they kept on showing pictures of her legs, but they didn't show pictures of, you know, who was running yesterday? Biden? They didn't show Biden's legs. But then there's a reason why when you watch news and you see women in dresses with their legs crossed and they have open desks. But you don't see that when it comes to men. Is there a difference? Yes. But society has made that a difference. And we need to understand the difference between running for office and having a political will and getting the job done. We have some fabulous women who are running and have run. And when women run, they win. Because we're very organized and we can multitask where men can't. And we make very good representatives. We run businesses very well. The question is that what we want to do? Because right now, I know on my side, I would pay for people to go and run for office. And they don't want to run. Women, they don't want to do it. They don't want to put the time in. And so, is it different? Not really. It's just we're different. We don't want to do that. We don't want to put it out there like that. We don't want to be exposed. We don't want to put the time. We don't want to. That's not what we want to do. But those that do want to do it, very few of them jump out and say, I had a bad time and I'm not going to do it again.
You know, talking about Donald Trump, you know, sometimes he says things that shock me. But what I found is that for so many years, we've done a good job of electing or nominating people for public office. They go to Washington, they go to Columbus, and nothing changes. The debt keeps getting bigger, the government keeps getting more oppressive, things don't seem to get better, they just seem to get worse. And then along comes Donald Trump. They said he couldn't win the primary, he did. They said he couldn't win the presidency, he did. I think there's a feeling in America, certainly in the Mahoning Valley, that finally there's somebody here who's going to Washington to fight for us, to fight for change, and to possibly take on the most difficult fight in the world. And that is to fight Washington. Washington doesn't want to change, and it needs to change. And that's why people are so excited to see Donald Trump fighting. It's almost like he's in a bar fight. And it's not pretty. It gets ugly sometimes. It's kind of messy. But damn it, he's in the fight. And people are excited about that. Because Washington, in the final analysis, is out of control. I think it's ungovernable. I think the federal government has gotten just too big for its britches. And there is hope that maybe we can pull some of that back.
I'll try to answer all those questions. But first, I do want to point out, it's an interesting, to me, it's become this Republican talking point. So I want you guys to note the date and the time and remember this in 2018 and in 2020, that Washington is chaos and there's all these issues. Well, right now the Republican Party controls the White House and the legislature and the judicial branch. So they're in control now. And I want you to ask yourself in 2018 and 2020, when you go to the polls, is your life better today than it was 3 years ago, 2 years ago? And if it's such a chaos, then in 3 years, everything in this country should be turned around, because Washington's ungovernable and unmanageable. Well, now it's controlled entirely by the Republican Party. So if that's the hat that they want to wear, and that they want to say Washington's just a mess and it's unfixable, and Donald Trump's here to fix it, well then in 2020, when you go to vote for president again, I hope that you consider that, keep that in mind. Now to your other questions about Ohio and women and gender politics, I mean, I think the I can't speak to the Republican Party the way that Tracy's been involved, and she's been involved for a very, very long time. But I do think the Democratic, I'm going to be honest, you're interested, you're asking questions. I do think the Democratic Party has for a long time had a more difficult time sometimes running female candidates. We have stifled female candidates that from a local level, old school gender politics has existed. And I think that the only way you break that barrier is if you recruit good female candidates and you run them. And you do that at the local level, at the state level, and the federal level. And that's the way that you can break that barrier. And then in terms of, you know, really responding to your questions on President Trump, I'll say this. I do agree to them with some extent that Washington is crazy when I find myself agreeing wholeheartedly with Governor Kasich on his positions on President Trump. So that's how I know that things are a little bit interesting in Washington at this time. When I'm like, oh man, I'm going to retweet this that Governor Kasich just said. That's how we know that, you know, maybe President Trump should put the phone down and do a little bit more governing. But we all know that. But I think that answered some of your questions. I'm going to let Chris close things.
So I truthfully don't know if there's much more that I can add that hasn't been said between the three here. But I did notice that nobody really addressed your question about how at the state level we're addressing you know, getting women involved in politics. So I can tell you that like from a DNC perspective, there are rules on the number of women who have to be involved. For example, I enjoy the privilege of being the president of the Mahoning County Young Democrats. The DNC specifies that the vice president in that turn has to be a female. So to kind of give you some institutional perspective there, and I'm sure that that's a norm between both of the parties. But there are measures in place to ensure that women do find ways to get involved.
Thank you.
The first question that I have for the panel is, as a British international student who is very new to US politics, could each member of the panel please clarify their parties as well as their own views on women's issues? Such issues that would be beneficial to clarify upon would be women's reproductive health services, abortion, and sexual harassment / abuse towards women. Could each member of the panel also discuss as to how each party intends to deal with such issues?
So I guess since I'll start with this one. Our party has long been the pro-choice party. We believe that in the case of, you know, for your question on women's reproductive rights, that it's your decision. It's a decision that you get to make, you know, in the privacy of your doctor's office, and that you don't need someone to tell you whether you have the right to make that decision or not. What were some of the other topics you want to know where our parties fall on things?
Just women's reproductive health services, sexual harassment / abuse towards women. Just basically what your party intends to do about these sorts of women's issues.
Sure. So I think that we've seen a lot of women. We've seen a lot of women coming forward, regarding sexual harassment lately. We had a very large Democrat donor, Harvey Weinstein, come forward, or not come forward, but have women come forward and say that that he was.
He was the opposite of coming forward.
Yeah, sorry. We from our perspective, we had Harvey Weinstein come forward. Or not come, I did it again.
we took him down.
Right.
Harvey Weinstein down because women came forward.
Right. So what you saw, Democrats returning the donations that Harvey Weinstein had given them. Locally, Tim Ryan donated all of the money that Harvey Weinstein had ever raised for him to women's health services like Planned Parenthood and to other charities like Emily's List. So I think that probably helps you. Maybe, I guess.
What I meant by my question is, what does your party intend to do about these things?
Well, I could jump in. One of the things that, in terms of confronting violence against women, we know 1 in 5 women in America is sexually assaulted while in college, and 22% of women experience that severe physical violence from an intimate partner. We actually have several female members of both the House and the Senate that have introduced. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who's a Democrat from New York, has introduced the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which we allowed to expire, which was an atrocity in my perspective. She's introduced legislation through her committees as well to confront the issues of military sexual assault. That has been one of her bread and butter issues as a Democratic senator from the state of New York. Similarly, in the House, we've introduced some measures that would actually come up with legislation that would, work to curtail this issue. Those are some of the things you have to do. You also have to fund, we have to, in terms of, when Democrats do budget negotiations and do budget bills, we want to put in funding for college campuses to be able to have the type of programs they need to deal with sexual assault. That's been one of the biggest complaints right now on a national level is the, Secretary DeVos? Yes. Secretary DeVos has, worked to, she's eliminating some of the Obama-era pieces of executive orders with regards to higher ed and college campuses and sexual assault. So those are things to me where I see a clear-cut difference on the political parties. I was raised by show me your budget, I'll show you your priorities. That's sort of the values that I aspire to in politics. If you're not, what your party wants to fund and where they want to spend our tax dollars is their priorities. That's just the truth. So if you're going to take something like, the Violence Against Women Act and certain programs about sexual assault on campuses and not fund them, then that's obviously not a priority to you. So most of the time when you see these pieces of legislation, they're to come up with, follow-ups to studies, follow-ups to what do we do with training, what do we do with places like, places like the YWCA and social service agencies that could be doing more on violence against women programming. So that is what our parties are trying, I feel the Democratic Party is trying to do on a national level is to fund initiatives that are going to solve those problems. Because that's what, if government's going to work for you, it has to come up with ways to solve things. Well, issues take money, they take funding, they have to be willing to fund programs that are going to make a difference. And if our only agenda is to cut taxes for folks, that's not necessarily going to be able to fund programs like we're talking about.
I just want to thank you for not, cutting me off and telling me that I definitely did not understand your question, so.
I am sometimes concerned when we hear about voices asking for help from the federal government to solve our problems. For my money, if we have problems and we look to Washington for those solutions, I think so oftentimes we're going to be disappointed. Sometimes I wonder why Washington is even involved in the education business. Education should primarily be a state issue or a local issue, not a federal issue. But as for the other issues that you raised, I mean, there should be no tolerance for violence against women, sexual harassment. I mean, those things are intolerable. They've got to be prevented. They cannot be tolerated. And I think you won't find any disagreement on this panel on those issues. But for my money, I would prefer to see most of those issues addressed at the state issue, or at the state level and the local level, rather than in Washington.
That I agree with. But it come from the Board of Trustees at every university is appointed by the governor. And I think it is mandated, and it should be mandated, that those trustees make sure that every campus is safe for not just women, but all. And when you violate anyone's space, and for harassment and or violently, there should be repercussions of it. I don't like the distinguishing of men versus women when it comes to violent harassment. Right now, harassment is really big out there, but there are men that are harassed by women. There are men that are abused by women. There are women are in power, and they will power also wrong. And so we need to be honest about that. I think everyone should be protected under the law, no matter what. And I think it should happen whether it be on campus. You guys have a law enforcement, you have a board of trustees. The funding comes from the state, and I think the state should take care of that. And I think we ought to make sure that our legislators put that money in the budget to take care of our college campuses, especially our state college campuses. When it comes to reproductive rights, as I said before, reproductive health is important to me. I do not believe in abortion, but I do believe that we ought to have education systems put in place. And it doesn't take a whole lot of money, because we keep on looking to the government to fund everything, but we don't want to pay anymore. And I don't know if you guys realize, but everything's going up, but our salaries are not going up. You know, you're graduating from college, but you're not being able to find a job that you can maintain a decent quality of life. We can't afford any more taxes. Right now here in the city of Youngstown, we pay high taxes, and state taxes, and income taxes, and unless we start doing something differently, and we have to go out and find people who are philanthropic. Me personally, I don't agree with giving back money that Weinstein paid to Tim Ryan or anyone else. If anything, take more and use it, and fine him. Hit him where it hurts. If you're going to harass people, if you're going to do something, you know, incarcerating him and him coming out in 15 years and being just as wealthy as he went in doesn't make sense to me. But when you go in for harassing people that you made money on their backs and taking his resources and putting them to women's issues, then I think that hurts you. Now you can become like me, and then you can see what it's like to go through life and not have a life. And that's what I think that we need to really start working on. Right now, our system is, we have the laws in place. We just don't exercise them. And I'll say this, when it comes to women and harassment, I don't agree with it. But we have to start speaking up. You can't wait 30, 40, 50 years and decide, oh my God, you're running for office, let me go say something in October now. It just doesn't work then. And I know it takes a long time for some of us to get over some things. And as a person of abuse, I can understand that. But I can't go wait until it's a good, prime, optimal moment and make it into a political conversation. Either I was hurt or I wasn't. And I think we need to start teaching our young ladies at a young age to not put themselves in a position to be hurt. But if they are, they've got to be able to go and tell someone. And we need to start going back to what I said initially. Communication is the key, legislatively and personally. And social issues will not help us if we don't communicate those social issues to the right agencies. Because they're there. And then making sure our laws are enforced by our judges.
Well, at this point, to ensure that there's time for you now to chime in, I'm going to open this up for questions and answers. In doing so, I would like to ask several things. One, if you're asking a question, please keep the question, not a comment. And direct it to one person on this panel, because we don't have time for everyone to respond, so that way we get more questions in. If I can ask the panelists to keep your answers a little short so we can get more questions in.
That's a tough ask.
I know it's tough ask.
That's a tough ask.
That's the aspiration.
We just stretched 4 questions almost an hour, so
Yeah.
choose your own adventure here.
So who would like to start? Yes.
On the issue of marijuana medically and recreationally, Donald Trump has come out in resounding support for nationwide legalization of medical marijuana, both on his campaign trail and while in office as president, even going so far as to pass a bill which included a limit on the jurisdiction of the DEA and the federal judicial system when it comes to the cases dealing with the use of marijuana in any form. My question for the Republicans, because I came in late, I don't know what your names are, I'm sorry, is where you guys personally stand on this issue and whether or not they would actively make an effort, whether or not you would actively make an effort to at least make sure that those who really need medical marijuana, such as those with debilitating seizures, cancer, and other terminal illnesses, mental illnesses such as schizophrenia, anxiety, and depression, and others, which medical marijuana has been shown in the vast majority of cases to at least treat symptoms of these illnesses, whether they be physical or mental, where you guys stand on that and whether or not you would take the steps to be able to make sure laws are put in place to help those who desperately need that kind of treatment.
Sure, in Ohio,
Just one of you.
in Ohio, that's already happening, obviously, with the passage of the state amendment last year. I think that was a good amendment. I've talked to enough people. I'm personally convinced that there are medical benefits from the use of marijuana under certain circumstances. So I think that our passage of that amendment last year was a good move. Whether it has to be adopted at the federal level, I don't know. I mean, we've got a great system in our country of states' rights, and I think that the states are, in fact, the laboratory of experimentation sometimes. And so yes, I think Ohio's on the right path.
Can I make an amendment to that?
Just a little if I can.
10 seconds.
Just otherwise we'll have to get into other things. So other questions we have? So you had one hand, or you wanted to say something. You remember what it was?
Yeah.
Who do you want to ask it to? We
Sorry, I
have
can't
Tracy
really
and Mark, Christopher.
Mark Monroe,
Mark, oh, okay.
Are you a
Yeah,
volunteer?
it was a comment.
would you like to volunteer, sir?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, it was a comment you made earlier. You said Donald Trump is here. We finally got somebody here to help us. And I was just trying to clarify on who us is, because honestly, from my experience, no, I'm serious. I'm just trying to see, because honestly, from my experience, there's been a lot of chaos and corruption everywhere, from the smallest points in community to aldermen to, you know, chief police and mayors and all that. And I feel like there's been a certain high thing of individualism. That's the point, like it's an I everywhere, to the highest point, even to the point where you said we can't trust our government to take care of our education, but those are the people that we're supposed to trust. Like, even you guys are leaders. So I was just trying to clarify on like who is Donald Trump here to help, and how is he going to help us?
Look, I think the Republican message is a message that applies to all people in this country. Creating a, you know, I have a prediction to make. I would predict that both the Democrats and the Republicans want the same thing. We want the best thing for our families, for our children, for our grandparents. No one's going to disagree with that. We just have a different approach as to how we get there, that's all. But what we want for ourselves and our families is no different. There simply is a belief in this country that the federal government has gotten too big, it's gotten too large, it takes too much of our money, it doesn't spend our money wisely. We think that we can do better with more of that money at the local level, at the state level. We think we could do better taking care of ourselves first, working with our families, working with our churches, working with our communities and our cities and our states, rather than Washington, D.C. That's what drives so much of the Republican message and Republican thinking.
So to take the money away from the government and give it to
Keep it here. We know how to spend our money better than they do.
Yes.
Well,
And
with
tell
the
us
topic
first
of
which person you want to.
anybody, with
Okay.
the topic of money and women's rights and everything, we look at it and yet there's still a pay difference between women and men. And what's the government actually doing to change that? We're putting money in different fundings and stuff like that, but we're still not equal in pay in any job. So what could actually be done is my question.
I was going to say, from the perspective of physical legislation that's been passed, the last time that we had major legislation passed regarding pay inequality, you had the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. But I mean, you're right. There's still an inequality in gender pay. I believe it's women make 82 cents for every dollar that a man makes.
79.
There.
Women of color make 66.
So I mean, there's plenty of. You're absolutely right. There's plenty of work left to do. And I might be mistaken, but I think that the last time that a major bill was passed was 2013. That did anything to even address it. So.
And the Democrats have introduced the Paycheck Fairness
Well,
Act. Sorry.
And actually, you're right. And so, because you're talking to the general, we'll put one person from the Republican and one from the
Well, here
Democrat
he
answered.
answers
So
the-
Democrat answered, so one Republican.
Dollar for dollar, equal jobs. It's pretty fair. But let me finish. It's pretty fair. I mean, if you're making minimum wage, we're both making minimum wage. If you are working, when I say that, in the same corporations. But I'll say this: there is a book by Mika Brzezinski and Huffington Post. Yes. A lot of times with women, we don't go in there and ask for it. Men are a little bit more brash when it comes in and going in demanding what they want. We are a little bit more reserved in going in there and saying, this is what we want, and if you don't, we'll leave. And it comes from a liberal point of view of looking at Mika. You know, and when I read that, I was like, wow, that's real. Because in my corporate life, I have been a little bit more reserved than going in and demanding that I get what I want. Where men are a little bit different than us. And I think we need to become a little bit more forceful in the workplace. Legislatively, trying to make that equal we're looking to almost open up everybody's paycheck. And I don't think that's gonna happen. Because when I start passing around paychecks, and as Dr. Jackson said over here about African Americans, same thing. We are a little bit more reserved in going in there and making a demand because we need the job. And I think that we need to make it to where it's a little more forceful. But I don't think it's changing it, and as far as the Ledbetter Act, it didn't do much. But I don't think anybody's gonna start opening up their paycheck and sharing what they make across the board. Men or women at any level, unless they're at a way low level that nobody cares.
Well, government, it's all public
Hold
record.
on, we got classified comments.
You know my salary, you can look it up online.
And just so you know, I'm an independent, so I don't have a side, so I'm trying to make sure it's balanced here. So, who else has a question for the panel? One, we can allow for one Democrat and one Republican to speak on this. So, yes.
Yes, I have a question. I would like to address this to Tracy English. Just to be
You can do it.
clear that I heard what you said.
Yes.
Okay. So when we talk about violent crimes against women and the issue of women, have you done a lot of study in reference to violent crimes against women, number one? And the other thing that I think I heard you say was that you don't understand why someone would wait 20 or 30 years that was a victim of abuse and then come forward. I just want to be clear.
What I'm saying,
on what
let me
you're saying.
be clear. I believe that I have, as far as extensive study, can't do that. That's you. And you are very proficient in it. But when I say this, 30, 50 years coming out, being politically in a political time because of decisions, because of enforcement, I think is a little bit unfair. Because we come out publicly. It's not like we come out and I come and tell my girlfriend, I come and tell someone else. We wait until an October surprise, and I tend to have problems with that. If you're gonna come out, the person, and I'm gonna use more as an example. I'll get the elephant out the room. In 1972, he has been a judge for a while.
Right.
With power, a powerful judge.
Powerful judge.
Very, and we don't think that there's a reason to come out because he's powerful. So we wait until he runs for Senate during a highly contested year. And now I feel more comfortable in coming out. In my personal opinion, I tend to have issues with that. I want to know why you didn't come out when he ran for judge. Because if you abuse me then, I don't want you to actually rule over people's lives as a judge, but then think you can go to Washington and have a problem. I need to come out against you now, because I don't want you sitting in my common pleas court, ruling over the local lives. Why would you wait until I'm going to run for Senate 15 years, 20 years later? And it's been almost 50 years since she actually said these allegations came up. My problem is with that time span. And it wasn't like he wasn't public. I mean, we can do this, but I mean, you have to know.
Yeah,
We can do this off air.
But
I think she was interviewed, she didn't come,
She was interviewed because she was pointed out.
She came out afterwards, I mean, the newspaper went after her, and then they kind of encouraged her to come out, but that's another story, because we're blaming the victim. I know we're not supposed to get there, so I'm a little, as a black female, probably older than everybody in here, okay, you know, I'm a little offended that we want to blame the victim, you know, a 14, 16-year-old. I mean, like, I'm the me too. I mean, like, I was sexually harassed myself. And the person that you had to go to tell about the sexual harassment was the person who was who was trying to sexually harass me. So, I mean,
But 50
really?
years, but 50
I mean, like,
years later,
really?
I mean, just
So,
expand
come on.
here. I'm 53, I was 3 years old.
Tracy, not only that, maybe her incentive to come out was because the women in Hollywood, if I'm correct, came out first, and sometimes that will prompt other women to take a step.
Do
All right,
we
we
get a
have
democratic
both.
point of view on
Please,
that?
Democratic,
Yeah.
please.
Does it really matter when she comes out? If the allegations are true, they're true. And I mean, it's assault, I don't care if it, I mean, to me, I want to know that would I like, if I was an Alabama voter, would I have liked to know that when that judge was, when he was running for judge? Sure, but now as a voter, when he's running for Alabama Senate, I still want to know it. So it's not, I mean, to me, the discussion on that, that's where the discussion gets political. That's a political point. Whether it's a crime or not, it's still, you know, still crime. So, I mean, I understand from your political perspective, okay, but at the same time...
I want you to come out, but I don't want you to come out. I want you to come out because you want to come out. I don't want you to come out because it's politically expedient.
But
and don't get me wrong.
But as a voter, don't we still want to know that?
Then I want you to come out against all people who are violent. Don't make it a political football. I don't think it's right. And then we have to also understand that good people make bad decisions. There are things that we do while we're sitting here on Youngstown State University campus, 20, 30, 40, 50 years in the future, you'll wish you didn't do it.
Yeah, but I'm 32 right now. I don't think I'm going to roll back to Struthers High School and be signing people's yearbooks. That's just me. I mean, that's just me.
We're almost out of time, and I want to make sure that we have time for one more question we can to our panel. Anybody else who's not asked this question, this is your chance. Ask our local representatives or people working with the parties here, Democrats, Republicans, about these issues. So, yes.
I've heard all the panelists say, like, we need more sex education, we need more access to birth control, yet Ohio is one of the few states in the United States that doesn't have mandated sex education on the books. And also, for the Obamacare birth control mandate is being rolled back if it hasn't already been rolled back. So how are we going to reconcile those things, whoever on the panel, how are we going to reconcile those things with also our desire to curb abortion?
So one Democrat and one Republican, please.
I'll go, and it'll be an easy, it's a very easy answer. Elect more Democrats.
We need to have a balanced country.
No, not in the state of Ohio. If those are your issues, we need to elect more Democrats. I mean, if you feel that your representation is, your viewpoints aren't being shared at any government level, then you have to elect people who share those viewpoints. That's as simple as it is. That's why, I mean, I'm with you about balanced government and happy mediums and moderation and legislation that reaches a happy medium. But when the scales tip one way or the other, the best way to balance that is to elect people who represent your view.
My sense is that when it comes to things like family planning and birth control, you don't need Washington, D.C. to tell you how not to get pregnant.
She specifically said the state level.
Well, let's include Columbus. I mean, I recall when I was growing up, you know, birth control was readily available. It was not expensive. I think fundamentally it's a personal responsibility issue, fundamentally. Certainly there's a role for government to play, but at the most fundamental level, we all need to take responsibility for our own sexuality and our own actions.
So we are out of time. I want to thank our panelists and our students for the